Welcome back, folks. I'm Frizz, and today I'd like to talk about the variant rule called Proficiency Without Level from the Game Mastery Guide. If you're looking for a gritty or maybe a little bit more of a realistic sort of campaign than the normal type of crazy superhero nonsense that normal Pathfinder can provide, then this is the variant rule for you, as it greatly changes the balance of the entire game. Normally, a character's proficiency modifier on any given roll is equal to their level plus 2 if they're trained, or plus 4 if they're an expert, and you kind of get the point. It gets higher as your proficiency goes up. If a character is at least trained in whatever they're trying to do, they add their level to their proficiency modifier under normal rules. This has the side effect of high-level PCs basically being superheroes and being literally unhittable whenever a low-level creature is trying to attack them, and those low-level enemies are also literally unable to, hit the PCs. This is interesting, but it doesn't really fit every kind of game. If you want a game where a group of bandits actually has a chance of beating a single high-level PC, then the Proficiency Without Level variant rule is for you. If you are using it, then it's pretty simple. Rather than your proficiency modifier for something that you're trained in being your level plus 2, it's just 2. This makes the numbers across the whole system far, far smaller and a little bit more manageable. Let's just get into the effects that this kind of rule has on games. Obviously, this rule change most heavily affects how GMs have to design their encounters. Under the normal rules, throwing a single creature that is 5 levels above the party at the party is most likely to result in a complete TPK. If you remove level from proficiency though, that fight actually becomes winnable. This allows for GMs to get way more flexible with their encounter design, as they can throw all different types of creatures at the party now. Normally throwing a bunch of level 1 goblins at a level 7 party is basically just a waste of time, as really the goblins aren't going to be able to do much. Really, the party's going to be untouchable, as the goblins are most likely only going to hit on something like a 17 or an 18 on their first attack. With Proficiency Without Level in place though, they actually are a pretty significant threat, and yeah, they're very squishy. They're going to have very low health and low damage, but in large numbers you can play a huge swarm of goblins, and normally once you're past the low levels, you're not going to be able to fight those kinds of low-level enemies, and it can really liven up the combat variety. Really, just that amount of creatures that the GM can now choose from with Proficiency Without Level is amazing. That doesn't mean, though, that a GM can throw a level 20 monster at a level 5 party. High-level creatures are simply just going to have effects that a low-level party simply cannot deal with, due to just them being high level and them having access to higher level spells, or just having certain effects that low level parties can't deal with. No matter what rules you're using, a flying incorporeal creature that can heal itself is going to mess up a low level party, as they simply don't have the tools to deal with that kind of creature. Also, the higher level a creature gets, the higher its damage and health will get, to the point where it can get out of control, as a low-level party simply cannot do enough damage to take it down while it's doing a ridiculous amount of damage. So, basically, yes, GMs have a lot more flexibility with Proficiency Without Level, but they still have to be reasonable. One part of this variant rule that can confuse things a little bit for GMs is how to handle loot. If a level 5 party beats a level 10 creature and then gets its gear, that can throw off the in-game economy, as the game really doesn't expect a low-level party to have that kind of equipment. It's an interesting situation that isn't objectively bad, as your players are definitely going to be happy to get better loot, but it's absolutely something to keep in mind. Just try not to go too overboard with letting your party get way too much loot for their level, and just try and balance out encounters where they fight single high-level enemies with a bunch of lower-level enemies where they don't get nearly as good stuff. Speaking of gear though, I love how this variant rule actually makes magic items that generally have static DCs or modifiers actually useful. See, a lot of magical items have effects where the target either gets a saving throw or they make an attack roll with the item, but the problem is that DC or attack modifier is always static, and that means after a few levels, it basically becomes irrelevant due to how everything's saves or AC will rapidly outgrow the item. As an example, once you're like level 10 or 12, almost any enemy that you're going to be fighting is almost guaranteed to pass the fortitude save against being deafened by a thundering rune. That's kind of lame and really takes a little bit of the interesting cool factor out of the rune because you can no longer deafen people. With Proficiency Without Level though, those items are going to be able to stay competitive for literally the entire campaign, which really spices up loot and can make loot a lot more interesting. As much as I have been singing this rule's praises, there is going to be one slight issue that basically any game that uses this rule is going to run into, and that is skill check DCs. Some skills use simple DCs that are not based on level, and there is a chart that Paizo provided for if you're using this variant rule, use this chart instead of the normal one for determining those simple DCs. The problem is, specifically for medicine, that chart doesn't work because it assumes that you're going to have to hit a 15 for a trained DC, 20 for expert, 25 for master, and 30 for legendary. And if you're going to be using medicine to reliably treat wounds outside of combat, which a lot of parties do, those DCs are basically unreasonable. So you're either going to have to lower them or just come up with a different table specifically for treat wounds, or what I would suggest, which is just ignore that you're using the Proficiency Without Level variant rule specifically for treating wounds with medicine. So you just add your level like normal and use the normal DCs only for this, so you don't have to worry about either making treating wounds way too easy or way too hard. Overall, while I have never actually played in a game that uses the Proficiency Without Level rule, I absolutely love the concept of it. While it does slightly reduce the odds of critically succeeding and critically failing, it makes for a much different type of play experience and a different type of game overall. Now, if you're traveling through the woods and you get ambushed by a bunch of low-level bandits, you don't automatically win. It's basically changes the genre of the system from a superhero movie into something a bit more realistic while still being fantastical, like, I don't know, Lord of the Rings. The GM can also really start to flex their muscles a little bit more, as they can now use 15 different levels of creatures pretty reliably to make their encounters. And normally, GMs can only use about 9, which really allows for a lot more interesting ideas for fights, and it's just super fun. I really hope that you check it out, whether or not that is in a one-shot just to test whether or not you like it, or in a full campaign for that gritty vibe. Thanks for watching. This has been an interesting video to make, as, you know, I haven't actually played with this rule, but I have seen a lot of people talk about it, so I hope that I haven't said anything objectively wrong. It is kind of interesting because this rule also makes some playstyles, like, say, blaster casters or summoners, far more effective, as the changes to DCs really makes blasting casting a lot better, and it really makes summoners better, as low-level summoned creatures can actually be useful. I'd like to try this rule out someday, but I'm curious, what are your guys' experience with the Proficiency Without Level variant rule? Regardless, until I see you next, live a wonderful life.